My name is Khalid Mahmood. Today's topic is the future of global energy and the future of humanity. My guest this week is Gail Tverberg. She writes on ourfiniteworld.com. Gail was a casualty actuary working in insurance forecasting. Since the early 70s, she has been interested in the energy sector and petroleum shortages and has written many academic papers on the subject. Welcome to Restoring the Mind, Gail.
Well, thank you.
All right, till 2019, everything was going smooth, or to some extent. At least inflation was in control, etc. No health pandemics, no food shortages, no price rises. The fuel at the petrol stations was affordable. Then all of a sudden, everything changed. We are facing one crisis after another. You have been studying the energy sector and the peak oil phenomena. How much of the blame for the price rise in oil goes to Russia's war on Ukraine and the sanctions, and how much of it do you think is to do with supply and demand? Can you separate the fact from the fiction for us, please?
I think it's at least 90% due to just a global shortage relative to demand. I think that back in 2018 was back when things were going sort of okay, but that was, the high point in like purchases of automobiles. That China was still buying our recycling and things like that. And in my 2019, things started to slide down, but it wasn't quite as obvious that it was sliding down. But it really was having problems. There were even some signs of financial difficulties back in 2019. And so 2020 was just a continuation of a trend, and the shortages got hidden by the COVID closures, but the shortages really started coming along back as early as 2019.
How do you see the long-term oil prices going in which direction? I mean,
Well,
obviously we know the direction, but how far do you think they will go in the long term?
that's a good question. Let's put it this way. Our wages will go to a significant extent more for oil and energy, our food costs, then we will not be able to afford much beyond food and the very basics as we go forward. There will be, we won't have the extra money for recreational activities and flying around the world to visit places we'd like to see and things like that. The Whatever we have is going to have to go more towards the basics. Now, whether that looks like high prices or it looks like we don't have jobs, it's not entirely clear how that all comes out. I think we think of it as high oil prices, but it may appear in different ways. It may appear through broken supply lines. You go to the grocery store and what you want to buy just isn't available.
Okay. You have named your website Our Finite World, meaning that we are kind of depleting almost anything and everything. Is it just the oil that is being depleted, or are all the natural resources being depleted?
Well, what happens is actually a two-way kind of a thing. It's both a combination of the population keeping growing, and secondly, all of these different kinds of resources being, we take out the easiest to extract first. So what happens is it becomes harder and harder to get enough fresh water for this growing population, for example. And it becomes harder and harder to get enough copper, and harder to get enough, we'll say, zinc and nickel and all kinds of things. It's energy supplies, coal and natural gas and oil, but it's minerals of all kinds. It's farmland that becomes in short supply too. And that's partly because, or a big part of it is the growing population. Part of it too is that, we lose topsoil by our farming practices, and there are many other things that degrade the farmland. So you have a problem in many, many different sectors simultaneously.
Okay. Gail, the modern empires, I mean, for example, the British and the American empires have relied heavily on the so-called fossil fuel energy. Is it just a coincidence that the American empire seems to be declining at a very fast pace, just as we are facing energy crunch? What about the previous empires? Did they also collapse because of they faced depletion of energy of some kind?
Well, I think what happens is that all kinds of, we're talking about something we talk about in physics terms as dissipative structures. They grow for a while and then they collapse. And the economy is sort of like a human being. You grow and then you maybe you have more of a stable period, but eventually we reach a point where it can't grow anymore, and it comes to an end. And it isn't necessarily that they run out of oil. It can also be just the fact that there's too many relative to the population. But we're definitely at the point where the supplies worldwide are becoming less and less available. So on a per capita basis, our supplies are down.
Okay. How do you see the energy sector changing in the near future? Is renewable energy the panacea that we all need?
Renewable energy is basically a fantasy. We have different kinds of fantasy renewable energy. We have the biofuels, which of course use farmland to grow corn for ethanol, or maize, I guess you would call it, for ethanol. And then we use rapeseed, or sometimes called canola oil, for a substitute for diesel. But this takes away from the farmland. So, this is not a solution. And we have the wind and solar, which are very intermittent, and they don't really work when it comes to things we need, like heating homes or providing electricity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So they're just solutions that we've been told about as if they were solutions, but they aren't really.
Okay. Do you think the Saudis have, and probably also the Russians and Americans, who are kind of the top producers of oil, do you think they have everybody has reached the peak oil stage?
I think we're pretty much at that point. It all depends on how high a price can be sustained, and that's in inflation adjusted terms. Theoretically, if you could somehow or other get the price up high enough and devote all our resources to taking oil and coal and natural gas out, maybe things would be different. But I think the oil production is headed on the downside, and it different things work together that you get more and more conflict as there's less to go around, and it's the conflict to some extent that brings the production down.
But the wages have been so low for the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, that I don't think people are in a position to pay the higher prices for the oil. So how would the big companies be able to kind of make their profits, or even invest in new resources, or trying to get more oil out of the same wells, if it's using more energy, more cost, and etc.?
Yeah, it's hard to see that. I think what has happened is that investors have seen that there are great big subsidies given for for so-called renewables. And of course, those renewables are made with fossil fuels, so it's just a different way of using your fossil fuels. But these investors go where the subsidies are. And as long as the subsidies are over there with the renewables, that's a big reason you get the push for the renewables.
But the subsidies are, only kind of, the Western countries are in a position to pay the subsidies, or what do the poor countries? What will happen to them? If the poor countries, for example, like what's happening in Sri Lanka, you may have read. They are
Right,
kind of
right.
facing a lot of starvation, and are they kind of facing the Malthusian moment? Are they kind of, how do you see the future of population in poor countries like Sri Lanka? They are kind of already, what do you call it, sending out warnings about so many people are dying already of starvation. So
Yes,
how do you see the future in large? Are we kind of going towards the Malthusian moment?
I think that we are in a way headed towards a Malthusian moment, as you say. The poor people in the poor countries tend to get hit first. I think Sri Lanka is one that we've been hearing about. Lebanon is another one we hear about. But there are many other places. Yemen is another one that we hear about. The population in these areas has risen, but in the whole trading scheme and things, they don't come out far enough ahead that they can buy oil and coal and gas from the producers. As it becomes more and more scarce, it's the ones that are, well, it's the countries that turned out poor that are having the biggest problems. But we were seeing that with the cutback in tourism affecting all of the poor countries that were depending on tourist revenue earlier.
So how do you see the population? Would the population be kind of be what's going to happen with large population?
Well, I think that the world population is going to start falling. That we know we have a fertilizer problem now for the crops for this coming year, and that's going to hold back the harvests. And we also have some problems with international trade with respect to all of this, it being very high priced and not necessarily having the shipping lines and things in order needed to do it, that there are going to be places that are going to be experiencing shortfalls in food as soon as we start depending on the crops that are growing this coming season.
Okay. And Gail, just kind of a personal question. I've heard you talk about God in a number of other interviews, okay, which I've listened to. And do you see religion making a comeback in the near future? For the last 100 years, the Western values have been kind of promoted and even to some extent pushed down the throats of other countries. But is that kind of I was kind of not thinking sometimes people what happens is a natural phenomena is people move from one extreme to the other, and if they have kind of moved, the West has moved into godless society, maybe the future is on the other extreme. Do you see religion making a comeback in the near future?
I think it may very well be making a comeback. Everything I have seen says that the way the universe is put together, there has to be some kind of a supernatural force that's behind it all, that gives it all the power that it has. And early people kind of saw this force there, and it really is there. And we have been taught that the government is going to save us. They can print money. This money somehow or other will transform itself into food. I don't know, but anyhow, they give us all kinds of crazy ideas. But that's really not true. And there's lots of evidence of people who were in near-death experiences and coming back and saying, I saw something just really marvelous when I thought I died, and then I came back, and there does seem to be things beyond the grave, and there's other evidence too that things happen that we don't understand. So I can imagine religion making a big comeback.
Okay. Any last thoughts you would like to add before?
Well, I wanted to thank you for inviting me to speak in your interview.
Thank you very, very much, Gail. And I will add the link to your website at the end of the interview.
Oh, well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gail. Thank you very much.
Bye.